next speaker is going to be Armando Guio Espanol, and let me give you a little information about him. As he comes, he's going to at least introduce himself very well to you. And he is online. Hello, Armando. Are you online? Are you ready?
Yeah. Hey there. Yeah, I'm ready. Thank you.
Okay. So let me do a little introduction, then you continue. So we have Armando Guio Espanol, who is a lawyer and a graduate from Universidad de los Alamos, which is in Bogota, Colombia. And he completed in 2014 with an honors degree. He also holds a master's degree from Harvard Law School and Masters of Public Policy from Oxford University. So Armando, over to you.
Thank you. Great. So I'm going to share my screen. Just great. Well, no. First of all, thank you. Thank you for the for this introduction. Thank you for the opportunity and this invitation to talk to Raymond, to all the team there at EGIGFA. So as it was mentioned, my name is Armando Guio. I'm a lawyer from Colombia. I'm currently based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm the executive director of the Global Network of Internet and Society Research Centers, which is this initiative that is a network in which we are 130 centers from around the world working on different issues related to internet governance, AI governance, and many other issues related, especially with the future of internet and the future of emerging technologies in this area. So EGIGFA is one of our members and is a very esteemed member of the network. We are very happy to have them in this group of centers, and it's a very important actor and stakeholder in the discussions we're having right now in Africa and potential collaborations that are rising in the continent. So it's always great to be with you, and of course here in such a prestigious fellowship as the fellowship that has been organized, the GhanaSIG fellowship, which we believe can bring a lot of opportunities. So we are very much, and I'm very much happy to be here. So basically, what I would like to share, and what one of the main objectives of my presentation is to share a little bit of the work we have been doing also on regulatory experimentation and regulatory innovation, and in that regard about regulatory sandboxes. And I will talk a little bit more about this concept and the influence it can have on the future discussions about privacy, about digital rights, about the future of internet governance, and of course, very closely related with the future of AI governance, which it's interesting, and perhaps what I would like to discuss with all of you is how all these topics are interconnected and the kind of relationships that we are having between all these topics, and that we will see in the next, actually, I don't think it's going to be next years, but actually next months, with all the decisions that are being made, all the discussions we have about AI governance, even on a global level, in the region, and in many other regions around the world. And of course, my area of expertise and perhaps most of my experience has been in Latin America, where I have been working with more than 10 countries in the region, supporting them to develop their AI strategies, also digital transformation policies and regulatory sandboxes. So that's part of the work I'll be sharing. So again, thank you, and hope that we enjoyed this session, and hopefully next time I will be joining you all in Accra. Sadly, I'm in a passport situation in which basically I'm renewing my visa, so I don't have my passport with me and I'm not able to travel, so I couldn't be there. But hopefully next time and for next opportunities, I will be joining you in person. So as it mentioned, the idea is to explore regulatory sandboxes and the impact it will have on the regulation and governance of AI and many more emerging technologies in the near future. So perhaps when we are talking about regulatory sandboxes, I always like to start with this quote and this very important message that was proposed by Roderick and Stiglitz, perhaps two of the most prestigious economists on the area of development economics, and basically two big thinkers of economic development. Basically, Roderick and Stiglitz proposed in this paper that was published at the first months and the first weeks of 2024, that we are in a turning point of the economic development strategy. Basically, what has worked in the past and the strategies and the ideas that were proposed by many in the past are not going to work necessarily in the future, right? And even in present times. Basically, what they're saying is that we are getting into a time in which new technologies such as AI and many others which are emerging basically are going to be game changers, and are going to be game changers even for economists, for social planners, for social sciences, for lawyers, for many. And what they are saying is that we are in an era of learning and experimenting. Basically, we need to be able to build policies, to build regulations, to build institutions that are going to learn. So we are, and this is an era because before that we could develop economic plans, we could develop policies that will be very much fixed, that we were going to to implement those policies. Now the challenge is about experimentation and learning, and that's something that sounds in some cases quite obvious and quite simple, but it's actually very difficult when you talk about experimenting with regulations, with policies, and trying to develop new approaches and increasing learning experiences, which for policymakers perhaps was not something that was expected before. So here we have the biggest question when we have this kind of proposals and this kind of ideas is that how can collaboration, experimentation, and learning be effectively promoted with government agencies of low and middle income countries? And that's perhaps one of the biggest questions. And some of the research I had been doing, and also as executive director of the network, has been like how basically we can develop this kind of experimentation and learning, and how can we put these words and these ideas from Roderick and Stiglitz and many others into practice. And that's where we have some tools available. So we have policy labs. Perhaps you have heard of this idea, and there have been some policy labs now for some years working on. And so this idea of developing labs in which you have policies in which you try different policy interventions. That's a way in which perhaps we can do that. Regulatory sandboxes is another methodology, another tool that can be used for experimentational learning, and I will talk a little bit more, of course, about this. I don't know if a little bit more or much more, and many other tools such as policy prototyping, innovation hubs, test beds. So we have different tools to achieve this, and that's how this policy experimentation is being shaped. Now the point is, how are we implementing these kind of tools, and what are perhaps the main functionalities that they have, and what can be achieved, and also what are the main limitations some of these tools have. Now, the interesting thing about this is that we have different tools and a set of tools, but regulatory sandboxes have become very unique and appealing. So many countries around the world are talking about more and more about regulatory sandboxes, and especially when we're getting into this kind of governance, regulatory discussions about the future of AI, about the internet governance, about future of privacy or disinformation, and many other topics. Regulatory sandboxes are becoming quite appealing, are becoming like the perfect solution for many of the questions we have. And why? And perhaps that's what I would like to share with you, this perhaps an answer to this why, and also that we discuss why do you think sandboxes are becoming so appealing. So we have sandboxes all around Europe. We have many sandboxes experiences. In Latin America, I can share with you some examples of sandboxes that are being developed, designed, and even implemented. In African countries, we have different experiences of sandboxes, especially in the fintech sector. Asia, we have also good examples with Singapore, for example, becoming a big power and big mover of the sandbox idea and theory, and also in the implementation side. So why is that? What's that about sandboxes that is making this so attractive? And in the US, we also have sandboxes, but on a state level, because of course there are some limitations to have federal sandboxes, but state level sandboxes is what we are getting right now from the US. So we can almost say that in every single region in the world, there are sandboxes being proposed. And that's perhaps what creates so much attention. The first thing I would like to tell you about sandboxes is that we have to be very careful, even super careful, when we're talking about this concept and this idea, because sandboxes as a whole can be divided into many other things. So the sandbox is a concept that can be divided into many other subcategories, if we want to call it like that. So a sandbox itself is a space of experimentation We have operational sandboxes, which are these sandboxes, this example from Harvard University, that these are these spaces where we test technologies, where we test new system, where we test this kind of innovations. And basically, we try to look into different, again, functionalities, or we look into different features of this technology. And this is mostly a sandbox. Actually, we can even test its safety, how secure it can be, the data that is being processed. So it's a space for testing a technology, and that's an operational sandbox. When we're talking about a regulatory sandbox, that's a very different approach. It follows the same idea of experimentation, of a safe space, of testing and looking into different solutions and different functionalities. But when we're talking about a regulatory sandbox, perhaps the subject, what is being experimented, it's a regulation, it's a policy. And that's what makes the big difference between a regulatory sandbox and a sandbox in general. So you will see that there will be data sandboxes, there will be AI sandboxes, there will be many other ideas of sandboxes, but not necessarily these are regulatory sandboxes. For example, this case of the Harvard sandbox, AI sandbox, is not a regulatory sandbox. What I'm going to talk a little bit more about is about regulatory sandboxes. So what are regulatory sandboxes? And perhaps one of the first definitions that we got was from the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, which is perhaps the first authority in the world that is decided to move into having regulatory sandboxes. So inspired, and they were very much inspired on this idea of a sandbox and a tech and a software sandbox, because basically this operational sandbox comes from the software world. It was a space for developing, testing softwares. And basically what they said is, this looks very interesting, but what if we use the same concept to regulation? And that's how basically we got this first definition, in which a regulatory sandbox is a secure environment where businesses can experiment with novel products, service, business models, just as in an operational sandbox, and deliver methods without immediately, and this is perhaps what makes a regulatory sandbox different from other sandboxes, and it is that it's without immediately facing the full spectrum of regulatory implications. That means that here there has to be something that is called by many as regulatory flexibility. Basically, regulations are not applying the way in which they will apply in many cases. Like basically here we don't have the full implication, the full liability, the full impact of a regulation being applied as it will work on a common basis. So basically here we have a very different scenario, almost like a parallel world, in which basically these technologies are being implemented. If they have a regulatory impact, or they should have a regulatory compliance issue, but probably those issues will not apply in a sandbox. But a sandbox is designed in such a way that it's a secure environment, that non-compliance will not have a spillover or an effect on citizens, consumers, or even on the whole market. In this case, for example, on the financial institutions and the financial markets. That's what a sandbox is. And that's basically what's being translated here. Why was this idea perhaps shared and proposed by the financial authorities? Basically because they were getting more and more requests from new companies that now we know as the fintech companies, especially, which were saying like, look, I have this very innovative product. I have this very innovative financial product, financial service delivery system, which can be quite influential, can increase inclusion, can increase access to credit. Actually, this is very, very, very good. But as a fintech, as a software industry, I'm not a bank. I don't comply with every single rule that you want me to comply with. But I have a lot of benefits. So what they were looking at, and the authorities here were, before just saying no and just shutting down these kind of projects, what they were asking themselves is, how can we perhaps test, look into these products, look into these services, excuse me, and basically say like, yeah, we can actually test this and look if there is a risk, if there's some kind of harm or potential harm for the financial market, for consumers, or actually the benefits of having these products available are bigger than the potential risks. How can we test that? And basically the sandbox idea came to be a very important idea in order to deal with this question. So there we got sandboxes, especially in the fintech sector, and we start getting like some main elements of or some main features of what a sandbox should have in order to be operational. So for example, from these cases of the UK, Singapore, Australia, we look into 4 main features, which are the first one, very clear objectives of what a sandbox wants to achieve. Later, we have as a second very important feature, the eligibility criteria. What's the criteria to select a specific company or entity to participate on a sandbox and to show their technology to the authority? The third, very clear definition of time and costs. In some cases, entities charge for this, many others, and I think in general terms, it's free of charge, but some try to charge at least some kind of participation or application process, and the tools that are being used for regulatory experimentation. And this is a very important feature because basically it's one of the most complicated and complex issues to be defined. What's the tool that is going to be used to promote regulatory experimentation? So in the case of the UK, they have restricted authorizations and exceptions. Singapore has some kind of flexibility and a case-by-case analysis, which is possible because of the legal system. Australia, for example, has exceptions as a license. So basically, they provide a license to these kind of participants that are being involved into a sandbox. So that's perhaps some of the elements that we are in discussion right now, and that's what these countries have been doing. But it's very important that we get these 4 elements, which are objectives, eligibility criteria, time and costs, and tools. Those perhaps are the most important elements to define when we are talking about a sandbox. And the operating model. How does a sandbox work? Well, basically what we have, and this proposal from the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, I think is one of the most clear and straightforward operating models that we have. So basically, we have like these 6 stages of an operation of a sandbox. We have an engagement process, an application window for different participants. Then we have to plan how the sandbox is going to operate. Then we execute that specific plan. Then we have these authorities monitoring, and this is also a very important point, the monitoring capacities that authorities have to track and follow a single technology and innovation project. That's something in which perhaps the success of a sandbox will depend on. And then a sandbox exit, the end of a sandbox, basically getting out of the sandbox and deciding if this product can operate, if this product should be open to the public, of these kind of projects or solutions or technologies should be shut down and should be banned from operating in a single country. So again, going back to this question, we have now sandboxes on many areas. So we can look into sandboxes on autonomous vehicles. We have sandboxes in energy, for example, on testing new sources of energy, such as hydrogen and many others. We have health tech sandboxes. So we have sandboxes in many topics. And of course, for AI, we have also many proposals of sandboxes for generative AI, for many other technologies, but especially for AI, we have a lot of sandbox proposals, ideas, and even sandboxes being already implemented as a measure. So why are they also becoming so attractive? And I already mentioned why they were so appealing for financial authorities, but there's also one point that is very important to understand here, and it is that when we are talking about regulating emerging technologies, basically we have 3 common stands, 3 possibilities. 1, wait and see. So before regulating a technology, so let's imagine ourselves that we have the quest of regulating artificial intelligence. One potential approach to this will be to wait and see. Let's wait how this technology is developed, deployed in the country, and then after some time, we will start getting into this kind of discussion. The other one will be to test and learn, like, okay, I'm not going to immediately regulate, but actually I want to learn more on how these technologies work. And I want to be more involved in the process of how some of these systems are being deployed in some specific sectors and the impact it can have on the IP regulations, on the data protection, social content that is being produced. So actually I want to test and learn more than just wait and see what's happening. And the other one is like just basically banning these new technologies. And we have seen banning and these kind of decisions being made. So, for example, many countries have banned biometric identification, for example, and biometric technologies that use this kind of identification and this kind of functionalities in order to identify a person. So we have seen this kind of also of approach from the regulation. Some will have said, hey, before banning this technology, I will have test and learn. Or perhaps others will have to say, I will just wait and see what happens. But perhaps the risks of many potential discriminations or many other potential harms for these kind of technologies will have take other ones to test and learn before banning. Because once you ban a technology, once you prohibit that technology from being deployed, it's going to be very difficult then to have it back. And that's something we have also seen from the theory and the evidence on how this kind of regulatory impact on the innovation system and tech ecosystems can take place. So, of course, the test and learn seems to be a more desirable approach for many authorities. First, because they show themselves as more proactive, that they are doing something, that they are actually using the time in a way in which they are developing capacities, but they're not necessarily prohibiting or banning a technology from being experimented. And that perhaps is what is making the test and learn the best approach when we are talking about regulating or having some regulatory decisions regarding emerging technologies such as AI. And the best tool perhaps for test and learn has become sandboxes. Not perhaps the best, but at least the most popular, at least within authorities, because there are many other. For example, the policy prototyping is a way of also testing and learning, but in a different level. Here we have sandboxes becoming perhaps the most preferable tool for testing and learning, and that's what is also interesting to analyze. So we have seen, as I said, many countries around the world. Here I'm showing just some examples. So Norway, they wanted to understand this idea of the black box of some AI systems, and they developed from the Data Protection Authority, they developed a sandbox, a regulatory sandbox in that regard. Germany proposed a whole handbook of regulatory sandboxes and how to develop it. The German regulatory sandbox handbook is very interesting because what they also did is that they analyzed their constitutional clauses, the German constitution, and determined where are those areas in which regulatory experimentation actually is accepted by the German constitution. And that's a very important task, because when we are, and what we have experienced when we are talking about regulatory experimentation is that there are sometimes that these projects start, there's a lot of interest about what is going on with regulatory sandboxes, and then authorities get into implementing this, and they look into the legal possibilities, into the legal framework that covers a sandbox that will allow a sandbox to operate, and they see that there are a lot of limitations that actually they cannot do what they were expecting to do. And here the German government decided to move ahead and said, okay, look, these are the constitutional clauses that allow us to have experimentation on these different levels. And that was, I think, a very good task to develop before fully deploying sandbox. We have the United Kingdom, and later I'm going to talk a little bit more about this report specifically, but we have also, of course, the Information Commissioner Office, one of the first ones to move the sandbox concept from fintech sector and the financial authorities into data protection authorities, and many others. France, Canil, again, doing a sandbox on data protection, a sandbox in Mauritius, also being developed in order to, especially directed to promote the use of emerging technologies. In Colombia, I was involved in the design and implementation of the sandbox of privacy by design and by default for artificial intelligence systems. So also a data protection AI sandbox. In Brazil, I have also supporting the Brazilian Data Protection Authority on developing a regulatory sandbox on generative AI. Chile, the same, a proposal for a sandbox in the country, one of the first ones, because in the case of Chile, is an interesting case in the sense that it's one of the few countries in Latin America where there has not been a financial sandbox. So there has been no sandbox experience before, and the first experience on a sandbox level will be with a sandbox on AI. And of course, India, for example, and the Reserve Bank, as in many other countries that have financial sandboxes. So we have sandboxes, as I mentioned it, and these are just some cases all around the world, many of them being proposed, some of them being designed, some of them being implemented, and that's also something to be aware of, and some of them, of course, not being fully deployed, and that has been one of the biggest challenges. So we have a lot of proposals from Sandboxes, and that's one of the things I will also like you to look into, and perhaps as a research question for the future, is that some of the Sandboxes have been proposed, not all of them have been fully implemented or finally implemented. So that brings a big question, like what happened, and what happens when these kind of projects are out there, but they are not implemented, or at the end they just are these proposals. Some of them are being finally designed, but nothing else happens. And perhaps one of the biggest elements that I wanted to show you, and I think is very important, is like what comes from a sandbox. What's the real result of a sandbox? We do a sandbox. Okay, let's say we decide to have a sandbox in Ghana on generative AI and IP and intellectual property rights, just as an example. Very hypothetical example. So basically, what are we going to get from a sandbox? And I think one of the best examples of what we get from a sandbox is this report from the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. This is one of the few reports we have had about the results of a sandbox and what an authority has achieved and has get from a sandbox. And it's very interesting if you can take a look at it, because it shows many things. The first one, that the Information Commissioner Office, first of all, they defined that they got a lot of elements, and they gained a valuable insight from the experience on monitoring and following and being fully involved in the implementation and monitoring and implementation and deployment of an AI system in a specific market. So the first thing that they say is like, okay, we got a lot of knowledge that we didn't have before. And we understand now a lot of things about this technology that we didn't have once we started. That's very important, because sandboxes, and one of the biggest quests of sandboxes, is to reduce information asymmetries, is to increase the knowledge and the learning and information availability that we have for these kind of institutions. And that's what I could recognize in this summary results and report of results that they drafted. Then they recognize that there have to be some specific measures that they didn't have before. And that's very important, because that means that they are in this sandbox, they are getting some ideas on how to perhaps start defining some specific guidelines and some specific requirements when AI systems are being implemented in a specific market. And here, as you can see, they included and they proposed 3 specific perhaps areas or requirements in which they will focus their investigations, but also in which they will focus their work and the work they do as an authority. So they say we have to pay more attention on how these companies are updating client contracts, developing tools and ways of working with clients, ensuring that suitable process tools are in place to enable data subjects to exercise their rights. This has to change. This is not a common way of processing data. This is a very different and unique thing. And basically, we need to pay more attention to how these specific points, and that shows that this is the areas of concentration, and the further areas in which they are going to also pay more attention are coming from this sandbox. So that's very much interesting to look into. And also what they see is that they have to improve, and they have to be more clear on the kind of information that they want to obtain from these companies, but at the same time on the kind of information that they ask these companies to provide to data subjects. So this is just an example, and I took these 3 elements just to show you how influential a sandbox can be on the research, on the kind of work that a data protection authority is developing, first of all. Second, it can be quite influential on the way in which they are approaching to the data and the current data protection regulations. So they have this whole set of data protection regulations in the UK, but now they're focusing on 3 specific elements about information access, data subject rights, and perhaps monitoring and especially looking into the client contracts and the conditions and requirements that are served to clients. So basically, they're concentrating on that, and they're thinking that perhaps some guidelines and some elements in the future must be more clearly presented for these companies to comply with data protections and to achieve the objectives and the final objectives of the data protection regulation. So this is what basically this is said to us, and what this is showing us is that sandboxes can have a big impact on what these authorities are finally deciding on the approach they're having to these technologies, and can have a big impact also and influence future discussions on the governance of AI, on the future of data protection regulations, and many other regulations that are being tested or that are being experimented within these sandboxes. And that's perhaps the influence and importance of developing a sandbox. And that's why I think sandboxes are also going to be so influential in the near term. And now we have, and it was mentioned by when I was hearing at the previous presentation, the AI Act. So basically, Europe decided on its Article 57 to promote sandboxes as one of the main systems and one of the main tools for regulatory innovation in the European Union. And basically, the EU is requiring member states to create at least one AI regulatory sandbox. So here we're going to have a big attention for sandboxes, a big movement towards sandboxes, and we will have, and the European Union has a challenge not only of developing these sandboxes, but also on the coordination system that they will have in order for all these sandboxes to operate in a very much coherent way. So basically, this is what we're getting, and the big question here is, okay, and of course we can later discuss this on the Q&A, but the European Union already proposed an AI regulation. They already have a regulation in place. But why still are they promoting regulatory sandboxes if they already decide on what to do with the AI regulation? And this is my perspective and what I think it's happening also here. And of course, discussing with experts and colleagues from Europe is that the AI Act is not a finished rule of the AI regulation. It's still going to evolve. It's still going to be, there are going to be still changes. Also on the implementation on a local level. And basically the sandbox is seen as a tool that will allow the European Union to take this regulation and to adapt it to different changes and to new technologies and to new innovations within AI systems. So as you know, 2-3 years ago, generative AI was not something that popular, that important. Now that has changed. And perhaps sandboxes can help to get these technologies tested and see how these regulations can adapt or can change or can be implemented towards these new kind of innovations. So sandboxes have to still be there, because even if we have regulations, sandboxes can become a way of helping these regulations to continue to adapt and adjust themselves to the changes that are coming, and to allow to perhaps overcome a little bit of this idea that regulation is always lagging behind innovation. Perhaps sandboxes can be a tool in order to change that perspective. Briefly, I would like to share with you a research I developed also with some colleagues, especially from the GIZ and CEPAL, the ECLAC entity in the United Nations. So basically trying to understand a little bit more of this growing interest about sandboxes in many countries, why these sandboxes were so attractive also for low and middle income countries and governments and agencies in these countries, and perhaps what were the main features that were learned from this experience and what we can get from what some of these first sandboxes that are being developed. And as you can see, so we have countries that we analyzed. So we analyzed the case of Brazil, of Colombia, of Bermuda, Ghana, Kenya, and Malaysia. And basically, I was able to interact with policymakers and agencies and authorities here. I'll look into the experience of each of these sandboxes and look into financial sandboxes. The Bermuda sandbox was very interesting. It was a energy sandbox that is basically they're trying to use the energy of the waves as a new source of energy. So they have to develop a sandbox because there are a lot of requirements for the operation of energy sandboxes, and basically and a lot of safety issues. So in order to have this kind of new potential source of energy, this has to be introduce a sandbox in order to start testing a new source of energy for the country. Brazil and Colombia, the AI sandboxes that I just mentioned, and Brazil with a more concentration on generative AI and other financial sandboxes that were here. The case of Ghana was also a financial sandbox. And perhaps some of the lessons, and I will go because I would like also to hear any questions that you may have, and of course any kind of comments that you have. But some of the main lessons that we learned and I learned, and this is something that I'm going to be publishing with colleagues of the UN and GIZ in the next weeks, actually next days. But basically, this reporting, which we look into these experiences and the lessons that we got from the experiences and with talking and what was an information shared by these authorities. Perhaps the first lesson on how these sandboxes are operating, and which I think it can be very valuable for this fellowship and for you as fellows on this space, is that sandboxes require of a cultural change or mindset. So basically, this is a new way of thinking and a different mindset it's required. And entities that want to implement these sandboxes need to be open to this kind of change of mindset. And there are different methodologies or tools to achieve that, but necessarily you have to change the traditional approach that you have to regulation, to agency monitoring and supervising authorities and the work they do. This has to be different. This is an approach in which what you are saying is I don't have all the answers. I need to learn more about the technology, and I want to learn with the ones developing the technology. So we changed this idea of I'm here to investigate you, to make you, to enforce the law, to, hey, I'm here to do that. That's not changing, but I'm having a different approach. Actually, I want to learn more from your experience and from your and from the technologies you are developing before making decisions or before just enforcing the law and getting into a conflict or the discussion in which basically the information asymmetries will not allow me to have a saying or a proper saying in that discussion. Then we have a second lesson, that is that innovation policies are very important as a general framework in sandbox implementation. So just developing a sandbox for the sake of a sandbox has become one of the things that these countries show us that was very difficult to do. So basically, if you do a sandbox just because, yeah, it sounds interesting, it sounds great, it will bring some attention. Actually, there's some funding for sandbox. Let's do it. If you do that, perhaps you are not on the route to success, because basically this kind of spaces require of a whole system of policies, or at least a policy that promotes and lets you to have a very clear objectives of what you are trying to achieve with these sandbox. So when we talk, for example, with authorities in Colombia or Brazil, they knew that they were developing these sandboxes because they knew that this is going to be important for the future of AI governance and AI regulation in those countries. And why they know that? Because the AI strategy says that these sandboxes are going to be used and are going to inform policymakers on the decisions to be made on the development of future AI governance bodies or structures or laws or regulatory decisions that are going to be made. So when you have those clear objectives, that is going to allow you to understand why you are doing that sandbox, what time of team is required, what kind of results have to be presented, what kind of monitoring has to take place. But if you don't have those objectives clear, and if you don't have at least a policy, even within your authority, about what you are trying to achieve, then perhaps a sandbox is not going to achieve its whole potential, or at least it's going to be very limited, or even it's not going to work. When we also got some examples of sandboxes that were not fully deployed because there were not clear objectives of what was trying to be achieved with the sandbox. They lost attention from different stakeholders. No one wanted to do any more with the sandbox, and the sandbox lost all the attention, all the relevance, and basically, yeah, disappeared. So lesson 3 perhaps is building interdisciplinary teams, and for these agencies and authorities, it was very important to start moving these discussions more and more about having and building this kind of interdisciplinary teams that are able to perhaps share more of their knowledge, and at the same time, they're able to work together on these kind of projects. This is especially important for authorities and agencies in which basically we had a lot of lawyers, we have a lot of social scientists, and basically people with the social science background. But here we have to be open also to work with tech experts, data scientists, bringing them and attracting them. And that's one of the biggest challenges, especially for low and middle income countries, is how to attract this kind of knowledge and this kind of colleagues and these kind of professionals into these kind of projects of these authorities. There have to be more incentives, and there have to be a very strategic moves in order to make this functional. But that's one of the biggest lessons that we got. Then we have keeping flexibility to promote innovation. So sandboxes should not be seen as very much. So in some cases, we saw that some countries were trying to propose like sandbox units and sandbox offices and a sandbox team very much organized and very formal and stuff like that. What we learn from these teams, is, especially from the financial authorities, is that they believe that these teams and the sandbox approach should keep some flexibility. So the people working on the sandbox units or working on the sandbox project can be also involved in other projects. It's even desirable that they're working on different areas of the agency. It's even desirable that these are not seen as very strict and formal structures for developing a sandbox, because that also creates a lot of opportunities for engagement, for bringing other team members. So if this looks at very close, very limited teams and very limited sandboxes, then basically you get something very strict, and perhaps you don't achieve the whole and the full potential of what a sandbox can achieve within an entity and the changes it can even promote within that same agency. And finally, there are just 7, and I'll go to my final remarks. We have sandboxes on relevant economic sectors. So again, we have to get public salience. We have to get these sandboxes to be relevant, because this is not an easy tool to implement. You need to generate some attention to why sandboxes are being developed, but they're being implemented. That's why I think we have so many sandboxes also on AI, because this is a very relevant topic right now, and that's why they are bringing so much attention to these countries. That's why Bermuda had this sandbox on energy, because it's very important for the country, as they are lacking resources and they are lacking sources of energy. But if you start developing a sandbox and a sandbox project within a sector that is not that economically or relevant and does not have that salience, perhaps you're going to be lost there. Then we have the necessity of sustained efforts and long-term success. So basically implementing a sandbox can take time, especially for low and middle income countries. We look into that, and it's taking at least a year for a sandbox to be fully designed, and implementation can take almost another year. These are projects that are taking a lot of time. So this requires a lot of patience and a lot of long-term efforts, and that's something in which we are not prepared for that. Then perhaps we should look into different strategies. When we are talking about AI governance and AI regulation, sometimes there is a lot of pressure of doing something and regulating as soon as possible. Sandboxes will need some time, and of course we want sandboxes to be implemented on not to take that long, but for now we have to be aware, and I think especially in low and middle income countries, that's something to be aware of. And basically, and lastly, building momentum for effective implementation, very much connected with the other point. Once we get attention and we get some kind of momentum for implementation, you have to use that and implement the sandbox, because some of these sandboxes started with a great design, started with great purposes, the best of intentions, but then nothing was achieved, because that momentum, all that attention that was created, was not fully used in order to achieve effective implementation. And again, strategic alliances and collaborative implementation, that's something in which basically we believe that countries should not work by themselves and agencies should not work by themselves. They should collaborate with many other authorities within their countries and even with international organizations, because there's a lot of attention on what is going on right now. And I think there is a lot of potential benefits from that. Here, I developed also a proposal, but I can share with you this research because I think we're running out of time. Perhaps what I would like to get myself into as a final point and to open the discussion and for the Q&A is that I think the regulatory sandboxes are going to have also a very important is going to be a very important element on the discussion of internet governance. Yeah. So basically, we're seeing a lot of questions about privacy, misinformation, digital power concentration, and I strongly believe perhaps 2 things. The first one is that sandboxes can become a tool in order to navigate many of these complex questions and some of the solutions that are being proposed in order to reduce misinformation, in order to understand some of the privacy concerns, in order to start testing some kind of digital power concentration, for example, just as some questions that we have, because we have many others on the internet governance realm, but perhaps these questions can be answered through a sandbox. And in any case, I think that we're going to see more and more sandboxes and more sandbox proposals in these specific topics. And that means that the results of a sandbox are going to have a huge influence and a huge impact on what is going to be the future of internet governance and many of the decisions to be made. Because of course, it's better to decide on something, to say something, just as ICO did. Once you have had all this experience and this learning experience and this experience of experimenting with the technology and the regulation, it's going to give a lot of, it's going to be a very strong argument, and it's going to provide a lot of evidence. And in that case, and in that sense, sandboxes are going to become very much important in this discussion. So understanding how sandboxes operate, being involved in this process, and also being open and also asking for participation, and also being open to participation on different stakeholders in these conversations and on the development of these projects is going to be, I think, one of the biggest discussions, and it should be very important to promote, as the future of many of these technologies of internet can be decided on these kind of spaces for experimentation. Of course, not every single country is going to be able to develop a fully functional sandbox. We're going to see what we have been calling with some colleagues a sandbox inflation. So basically, a lot of sandboxes and a lot of sandboxes being proposed by many countries. That's going to generate, hopefully not a race to the bottom, but basically there's going to be some kind of petition to get attention for the sandboxes. That's something that I think we should avoid. I think that we should try to increase collaboration, and we try to have this kind of regional experiences, even countries that already have sandbox experience. For example, if we have countries already in Africa developing a sandbox on generative AI, why they should not share this with their colleagues in other African countries. That's something we're also talking and discussing about in Latin America, and also on a global level. Even colleagues in Southeast Asia or Asia sharing their experiences with colleagues in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, in the US. This is something in which basically we should not try to duplicate efforts, and I think it's something in which we can also interact and learn more from each other. So that's perhaps my last call, and something that I think is going to be very important. But at the same time, I think we need to understand, we all need to have a basic knowledge of what a sandbox is, how it operates, what it's trying to be achieved with a sandbox, as the influence of a sandbox on the future governance and policy discussions. I think it's going to be increased, especially in the next, with decisions such as the AI Act promoting sandboxes in Europe, and in many other countries, we are going to see this just growing and growing. So that's why I think this topic, it should be considered and fully understood, and at least the basics should be clear for those interested in these topics of AI and internet governance. So that's my presentation. Thank you. Open to questions. And yeah, again, thank you, EGIGFA, thank you, Raymond, and thank you all for this great space and this great invitation. Thanks.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Armando.
Yeah.
Armando, that was a great presentation. And we have a couple of questions. So the first question says,
thank you very much, Armando. I believe you can hear me from where you are.
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So my question is in relation to consumer protection. With the developed economies, you don't have much problem with consumer protection because your system is really robust when it comes to protecting the interest of the consumer. But with low-income economies and African economies like ours in Ghana, protecting the consumer is key. So I wanted to ask your opinion in relation to regulatory. How do regulatory sandboxes balance their innovations with consumer protection?
Yeah, and consumer protection has been also one of the topics that has been highly discussed about how basically sandboxes are also applied to consumer protection regulations. And I think that there are going to be some questions because the relationships have changed. So the relationship of a consumer, a producer, a provider have changed right now. Now we have what is called this algorithmic intervention or intermediation, which is changing the whole consumer relation. And basically, I think that when you get with that idea and with that complexity to a consumer protection agency, basically they need to understand more what is meant with this kind of algorithmic intervention or intermediation. Because basically, some companies are basically saying like, look, it's not me, it's an algorithm. I don't decide about this. I don't decide prices. I don't decide about these kind of things. It's an algorithm. It's this kind of technology that is deciding the prices, and it's setting this kind of of price, for example, understanding how that technology works, how it operates, and how this kind of complex argument can be understood. It's something that which at Sandbox, I think we can perhaps understand and see how much of it's really like an algorithm independently working on, and basically how much of it's decided by the people that are modeling and that are developing these kind of technologies. And perhaps we are going to have new actors involved in the consumer protection area, not just only the companies providing the products, but perhaps also these intermediaries and these kind of algorithm developers. So those are the questions which I completely agree. In consumer protection, it seems sometimes to be very straightforward, very clear, the relationship, when there is a relationship with a consumer, where there is not a relationship with a consumer, with the internet that has been changing, of course, with algorithms that have become more complex. And I think now authorities in many countries, and not only in countries where these technologies are fully deployed, but also in low and middle income economies, they have to be prepared to answer these questions. And Sandboxes in some way can be helpful to get some of those responses.
Okay. Yeah, okay, right. So the next question.
Okay, so my name is Frimpong Daniel. I want to find out what is the challenges of the geopolitics of AI and the rise of digital sovereignty.
Thank you. So the question is about the challenges of the politics of AI. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think, well, of course we are now in a stage in which basically of politics and geopolitics have a lot to say when we are deciding on AI and AI governance and the future of AI and how it's going to be regulated. We have different approaches to this, of course. For me, at least, and also connecting this question with the sandbox theory and perhaps knowledge that I have, is like sandboxes are becoming a way, for me at least, it has something that is interesting, that is becoming a way in which countries and agencies within every single country develop their own experience and their own saying about how these technologies should operate. And that's something that is quite desirable, and that's something that I think is quite positive of developing sandboxes, because I think that countries need to have their own saying in these kind of conversations. And if we want to really have a more inclusive approach to AI, each single country should have that own experience, and that own experience not only with the regulations, but also with the technologies that are being discussed, with generative AI, with more of these systems, with the very much advanced neuronal networks that we have right now, and many other of these LLMs and technologies that we are having right now. We should have the opportunity to get in contact with this, and I think sandboxes are also helping a lot in that regard. At the same time, for many experts, sandboxes are going to become an element of harmonization, and an element that is being, as it is being shared by many countries, is going to help also for the harmonization, and that's going to be very important for many of the political and geopolitical discussions that we're having about AI, because if countries, and many countries, are all agreeing on having these kind of spaces, then there's going to be a space for harmonization and perhaps to get in something quite similar. I think that that's something that is partially true. I think that sandboxes can help to get this kind of harmonization and avoid a very big fragmentation on how these kind of rules are determined in different countries. But at the same time, I think it's also going to allow for some specific elements from each country and from each experience. And in that sense, I think in the politics also of AI, this will also be a demonstration on how these stakeholders and the stakeholders within each country are acting, are having these discussions, and are interacting. And that's what a sandbox is presenting. So basically, it's also an opportunity to look into how this kind of engagement is taking place. Just as a last point on that, many have called regulatory sandboxes or criticized sandboxes as a new way of regulatory capture. And I think the politics of AI and the politics of how this kind of interactions take place is going to be very important. I think in some cases, this can become a figure of regulatory capture if proper measures are not in place, but not necessarily a sandbox is a way of regulatory capture, and not in every single case is going to be like that. So I think there are authorities with enough maturity and experience in order to deal with that. But that's also part of the politics side of this that is going to be interesting to look into.
Okay, so the next.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation. As a program director of e-governance, I thought you were going to delve so much into e-governance, but nevertheless, I have some questions on e-governance for you. One, in your view, how can e-governance contribute to achieving the UN SDGs? That is one. My next question is, how can e-governance are you sure?
I lost you there.
Okay, so that is just my question.
Okay, the e-governance and SDGs, yeah. Well, it's also very interesting that, and thank you for that question, because it's also, we are also discussing a lot on the, on how to, the e-governance, of course, it's going to be very important because we're living more on the internet and online. And of course, if we're trying to achieve a more sustainable world, there also have to be conversations about how the internet, it's helping towards developing that kind of sustainability and a more sustainable ecosystem. Sandboxes, and that's a big question that we have now, are being used in two ways. Regulatory sandboxes are being explored in order to promote that regulations are in place so that we develop a more sustainable use of technologies. And also sandboxes, but not regulatory sandboxes, but sandboxes in general, are also being discussed as a good way of promoting new technologies and new approaches that increase SDG compliance, if we want to call it like that, or at least that we achieve more of the SDGs in many countries. So there is this new movement of sandboxes and sustainability and SDGs, and how sandboxes can become these spaces also for this kind of SDG implementation, and how to promote and increase that. And also when we're talking about e-governance and of course also internet governance, basically how they're helping us to govern technologies, for the public good and for these kind of purposes. So that's a new area of research. I think there we have more potential on the sandbox as a big concept, not as a small concept. And I think in that sense, we're seeing sandboxes helping to promote, again, new ways of clean energy, new ways of interaction with technologies that promote better labor conditions. We're seeing many other applications of SDGs through sandboxes that I think are going to help us to build more sustainability. E-governance is going to also perhaps feel the impact in some cases when some of these conclusions are met. And I think, again, that's a question of how all these topics interrelate, but I think there is a movement towards getting more into this kind of discussions, and that's something in which I think we're going to see more. And actually, for the G20 in Brazil, we're working on preparing something with the network of centers on sandboxes and sustainability, in which I think we can also try to address a little bit more of the impact of e-governance also in that regard. But for me, at least, this discussion and discussions on e-governance are, of course, fundamental for these kind of sustainability questions that we also have. We are more interconnected. The internet, the information that is being promoted, have a huge impact on sustainability, and basically it's something that we have to address. And it's something in which SDG work, SDG implementation cannot be in some way indifferent, or look into not to look into the e-governance and the internet and the impact it has on sustainability. So that's my reflection, more than an answer.
Okay, so the next.
So mine is not necessarily a question. I just want you to throw more light on lesson 6.
Sure. So going back to lesson 6 on the necessity of sustained efforts and long-term success for sandboxes. Well, but I can say a little bit more is that it will sound like, especially in these low and middle income economies and countries, basically what we look into is that the process is not as it is, as you can imagine. Like, there is the proposal for a sandbox, the sandbox is designed, and then it's implemented, and this takes place almost simultaneously, or almost in a very organized timeline. What we have seen is that the sandbox is proposed at the first time, There's funding just for example, there's just funding or just support just for the proposal. That creates a lot of attention, sometimes positive remarks, negative remarks, there is positive feedback. There is what we call the appetite for a sandbox. It's demonstrated that that's happening. And then we have to work on the design of a sandbox. And then we have to work on implementation. And that's, as I mentioned, that's not necessarily taking place immediately. Then we are facing a lot of challenges, changes in administration. So again, going to politics, changes in government administration, a new president and new administration. We have to share and why this is important, what was being developed before. Some have more interest on this, others don't have. So there you see how we start losing some of the attention, some of that momentum that we gained from the beginning. It becomes more complex. Then the access to funding, the access to the team, people start leaving because, of course, that's the natural way of in many public agencies, like people leaving, or some of the leaders of these projects just changing of departments or agencies or anything. So this is the kind of challenges, and that's why building this kind of long-term project and being able to make this to sustain itself through time, it's a big challenge, and that's something in which I believe there have to be more strategic thinking. And the first thing under the strategic thinking is that a sandbox cannot only rely on one person or one unit or one single entity. There have to be more entities involved. Connecting with one of the other lessons, this has to be part of a policy and a country policy. Yeah? Because if this is just a project within an agency, within an authority, perhaps that's not going to have enough relevance to be a sustainable effort and to sustain the long-term, the long-term in which mostly it is involved. And perhaps the other big point, which I will also highlight, is that strategic alliances, international networks, international organizations, if they are involved, that's also very helpful. Yeah. So if you have these kind of entities involved into these kind of projects, they are also going to continue to create attention and say, hey, I already look into this, I really like this. Some of them even invested. So for example, development banks or other kind of agencies, hey, we really need to look at this as something that is being implemented. And that's the kind of strategic thinking I'm also proposing. And I think it's important on that lesson 6, like we should not just work, we should be aware of that, and we should work to create those kind of mechanisms that will allow this to be a sustained effort and not to be something in which, and don't go with the idea that a sandbox is going to be implemented in 2 months. That's, I think in any case that has happened, especially because this is something new, quite innovative. There are a lot of risks, many officials, and I understand that a lot, and I don't judge them, are quite risk adverse. So basically you have to deal with that and know yourself that for now we need to still get a lot of people convinced. That takes time, that takes some time, resources, many things, and that's what you have to be prepared for. And that's perhaps lesson 6 a little bit more expanded on what was meant on that.
Yes, thank you, Armando. And we have one last question for online. So Mawena Lavish, can you please ask your question?
Okay, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you, Armando, for the presentation. My question seems you may want to correct me if I'm wrong, but I keep hearing government, and it looks like it's up there in terms of bilateral, or I mean, governments discussing or looking at implementing all these things. Looking also on your website, I saw one of the guiding principles is about openness, collaboration, and then diversity. But throughout your presentation, I've hardly heard anything about how the grassroots, the people who we are preparing this for, and then the entire system, how they are integrated in the entire process. So if you could, I mean, make give any point to that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I completely agree with you. And that's perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we have. So what we had been doing from the network is trying to also trying to, of course, we have to start with the governments that are interested in this, and because regulatory sandboxes, of course, need of regulatory agencies that have the capacity and legal capacities to work on experimenting with the regulation. But I think the next stage and what we're working towards is like to increase participation. And for example, when we are working with countries such as Chile or Brazil, or in Southeast Asia, for example, now we have some cases like we are also trying to increase participation. We are trying to show them that, and basically the quest here is to increase participation, not only from companies or startups or tech entrepreneurs that are developing these technologies, but also from civil society, from academic experts, and that are also able to inform these processes, to get into these processes, and to get into the whole experience of a sandbox. And that's one of the things, of course, besides bringing this expertise, we want to do that. The challenge there is that, of course, we have a lot of constraints, and more than is like governments have a lot of constraints, especially when they're developing sandboxes. What is happening is that the success of a sandbox is also possible, and this is not because I will before sharing this idea is like I completely agree that there has to be more participation, but I also want us to be aware that there is a big, perhaps, limitation, or at least challenge for this participation, and which is something that we have to work on. Like it doesn't mean that there cannot be participation or there should not be, but there is this thing that basically a successful sandbox is a sandbox in which information is properly shared and companies are open to share some confidential information and perhaps well-protected information with authorities. That is even a limitation in many cases. Many companies or many of these developers decide not to work with some countries because they believe that there are not proper measures to protect their technology, their code, and many of their industrial secrets. And that also creates limitations for participation, because basically what they're saying is, okay, I'm sharing this with you, you are the authority, I can control what you do and what you say, but am I going to share this with whom? With the civil society as a whole, with a whole group of experts? Like, wait, I can definitely not share this in such a way. And that's where we need to find a balance, and that's where I think this is just a conversation that is starting. The conversations about sandboxes are just starting. We need to still develop a lot, but if we are able to develop some kind of methodology, some kind of working methodology in which information is shared, participation is possible, some of this information is also shared with some of these participants, and we are able to develop this kind of trust in the project and in the way in which the sandboxes are operating, that could be super helpful. And that's one of the challenges we have, and that's one of the things we would like to achieve. And I think also I see many of the centers of the network working towards that, getting more interest on thinking on this, and on a global level we're having these kind of discussions, and hopefully, there are many lessons to be learned there. And I think also my colleagues like to also that we are open to these kind of discussions and to see what kind of proposals, but also that we understand how complex it is, that now we're in a first initial stage of working with governments, but that initial stage of working with governments, I completely agree, should not limit itself, that the second stage should involve many more stakeholders. And of course, from this academic network, that's perhaps our biggest quest or biggest desire. Yeah.
Let's give a round of applause for Armando. Yeah,
Thank you.
Armando, it has been such a great presentation, and we
Thank you.
look forward to seeing you in Ghana very soon.
Thank you. Yeah, just as a final intervention, thank you very much again. Thank you to EGIGFA. I hope you continue enjoying the fellowship. Please, also happy to see more of your engagement with the network of centers. We are very happy of having EGIGFA as a very important entity within our network, and hopefully there are more things coming. So this is just the beginning. So thank you again. See you soon. Take care.
Yeah, see you soon. Thank you.
Bye,
Yes.
Armando.
Okay, so I think it's time for lunch, but we are going to have to sit in a little.